Number 1. Derrick Todd Lee. Let's start with a man who terrorized an entire region of Louisiana for years, while the police searched for the wrong kind of suspect entirely. His name was Derrick Todd Lee, and he would come to be known as the Baton Rouge Serial Killer. Derrick Todd Lee was born on November 5, 1968, in St. Francisville, Louisiana, a small town in the northern part of the Baton Rouge area. He was the second of 2 children born to Samuel Ruth and Florence Lee, a couple who weren't married and who separated during his childhood. His mother, only 17 when he was born, didn't even list his father on the birth certificate. Instead, she went on to marry a man named Coleman Barrow, and it was Barrow who helped raise young Derrick alongside his mother. His biological father, meanwhile, had a documented history of serious mental illness. He suffered from bipolar disorder, schizophrenia, and major depression, and had a history of domestic violence as well. In fact, in 1991, Lee's father was arrested for attempting to kill his second ex-wife. He aimed an unloaded gun at her and pulled the trigger repeatedly. He was later found incompetent to stand trial and was committed to a psychiatric hospital for treatment. Derrick grew up in a rural, mostly black community called Independence, living around extended family for much of his childhood. His mother has been described as strict and domineering, while his stepfather took on much of the day-to-day parenting. As a child, Derrick was restless and hyperactive, and by around age 9, he developed a disturbing habit. He liked to watch people. Neighbors would notice him standing unervingly still while staring at them. He took up bird watching as a hobby, but he was also caught multiple times peeping through windows at girls, including his own cousins and his sister. He wet the bed into his early teenage years and sucked his thumb well into high school. His IQ, tested repeatedly throughout his youth, ranged between 70 and 91. He struggled badly in school, was placed in special education, was bullied for it, and eventually dropped out in the 11th grade. In 1987, he moved to Zachary, Louisiana with his girlfriend Jackie Sims, and found work as a pipe fitter. They married the following year. Not long after his son was born at the end of 1988, the marriage began falling apart. Lee started disappearing for days at a time, spending his nights in bars, picking up other women. In 1990, during an argument, he twisted his wife's arm and threw her out of the house. She filed a restraining order. After their daughter was born in 92, Lee abandoned the family altogether, only returning briefly before falling back into old patterns of abuse. He was in and out of prison for burglary, spent years apart from his family, and continued a pattern of infidelity, eventually fathering a 3rd child with another woman he'd met at a bar. Now, before any of the murders, Lee already had a long criminal record stretching back to childhood. At 13, he was arrested for breaking into a candy shop. At 16, he was arrested for attempted murder after a knife fight. Relatives reported him for peeping through windows. He was convicted of unlawful entry into a home. He was suspected of slashing 2 teenage girls with a blade at a cemetery. He served hard time for burglary, and even after parole, he was arrested again for being a peeping Tom. Time and time again, Lee was flagged for exactly the kind of behavior that, in hindsight, was building towards something much worse. And in the years right before his killing spree became public knowledge, women in the area reported him following them, propositioning them, and in one case, sexually assaulting a stranger in broad daylight. The murders themselves began, as far as investigators could piece together, in April of 1998. 28-year-old Randy Mabrewer disappeared from her home in Zachary in the middle of the night. Lee, who had been prowling around her house before, broke in, attacked her violently, and dragged her outside where he raped her. Her body was never found. Her ex-husband became the prime suspect for years, since he had a troubled history of his own, but investigators eventually cleared him. In September of 2001, 41-year-old Gina Wilson Green was strangled and raped in her Baton Rouge home, her body left on her bed. In January of 2002, 21-year-old Jerlyn DeSoto was bludgeoned and then stabbed to death in her home in Addis after letting Lee inside to use her phone. She tried to fight back with an unloaded shotgun, but Lee overpowered her. In May of 2002, 22-year-old Charlotte Murray Pace, who had just become the youngest NBA graduate in her university's history, was stabbed 81 times in her new apartment. It was one of the most brutal of all his attacks, and it's the murder that would eventually send him to death row. In July of 2002, Lee attacked 46-year-old Diane Alexander in Breaux Bridge. He talked his way inside her home under the pretense of needing a phone, then attacked her, choked her, and tried to assault her. She fought back and managed to survive, the only one of his known victims to do so. Her son interrupted the attack, and Lee fled. Alexander later gave police a description that would prove crucial in identifying him. Later that same month, 44-year-old Pam Kinnemore was abducted from her Baton Rouge home while taking a bath. She was driven to a remote area, raped, and had her throat cut so severely she was nearly decapitated. 2 separate motorists actually spotted her alive in Lee's truck before her death, one of them even reporting the sighting over CB radio. In November of 2002, 23-year-old Dean Collum was abducted while visiting her mother's grave in Lafayette. She was raped and beaten to death. Her body found days later in a wooded area. And finally, in March of 2003, 26-year-old Carrie Yoder was abducted from her Baton Rouge home, raped, beaten, and strangled. For years, investigators were chasing the wrong profile entirely because of an inaccurate FBI offender assessment and mistaken eyewitness accounts. Police believed they were looking for a white suspect. Thousands of white men in the area were tested for DNA with no matches. It wasn't until a private lab used a new kind of ancestry-based DNA analysis, one that indicated the killer was predominantly of African descent, that the entire investigation shifted direction. Once police in the small town of Zachary heard the new profile, they realized they already knew this man. They'd investigated him for a Peeping Tom incident, and even had a DNA sample from an earlier case. That sample matched. Lee, sensing the walls closing in, had already fled the state, sending his family to Detroit, while he moved through several states before ending up in Atlanta. After a 5-day manhunt, he was finally captured hiding in a motel there. He was tried twice. In one trial, for the murder of Jerlyn DeSoto, he was convicted of second-degree murder and sentenced to life in prison. In the second, for the murder of Charlotte Murray Pace, he was found guilty and sentenced to death. He spent 12 years on death row before dying of heart disease in a hospital in January of 2016. Interestingly, an entirely separate serial killer, Sean Vincent Gillis, was later found to have been operating in the very same area during the very same years, completely unconnected to Lee. And for a while, an urban legend spread that Lee used a recording of a crying baby to lure victims to their doors, a rumor police always denied, but one that made its way into pop culture anyway. Years later, in 2018, Lee's own son would be arrested and eventually convicted in connection with a shooting at Lee's old house, closing out a family story shadowed by violence from beginning to end. Number 2, Gregory Harris. This next case isn't about a serial killer. It's about a marriage that ended in a stabbing, and a woman who never got to walk away from it. Chiquita Tate was 34 years old, a defense attorney who had built her own law firm in downtown Baton Rouge. Those who knew her described her as fiercely dedicated to her clients and to the idea of justice itself. She'd grown up in Baton Rouge with 6 siblings and was remembered even as a child as strong-willed, someone who questioned everything and was cautious about who she let get close to her. Friends always told her she'd make a good lawyer, and eventually she went back home to Louisiana to attend law school after briefly working as a legislative secretary in Atlanta. In late 2007, Chiquita met a man named Greg Harris. She fell for him almost immediately. She told her mentor, a juvenile court judge, that she'd met the most wonderful man and wanted her to perform the wedding the very next day. Louisiana law required a waiting period, so they held off a little longer. But there was something the excitement glossed over. Just weeks before their marriage license was even issued, Harris had already been accused of domestic violence against her, an incident from December of 2007, where he was accused of using force against her. He pleaded not guilty to that charge in March of the following year, then simply didn't show up to his court date, resulting in a new warrant being issued for him over the mishearing. Despite this, the couple married on February 8, 2008, in a small ceremony attended only by close family and a couple of friends. They settled into a home in the suburb of Baker, Louisiana. To their neighbors, they looked like a perfectly normal, even admirable couple. People described them as pleasant, well put together, The kind of couple who kept a beautiful lawn and always seemed generally concerned about everyone around them. After Hurricane Gustav tore through the area in September of 2008, neighbors specifically remembered Harris, a carpenter by trade, checking in on people and offering to help however he could. But underneath that surface, the marriage was already unraveling. According to a later police warrant, Chiquita had been planning to divorce Harris over ongoing marital problems, and she'd even lease her own apartment separate from their shared home. None of that was visible to the people around them. As far as friends were concerned, she seemed like a doting wife with no signs of trouble at all. On February 20th, Chiquita's body was found inside her own law office. She had been stabbed 38 times. At the time, she'd actually been in the middle of representing a defendant in a high-profile murder trial. Investigators quickly turned their attention to her husband. While questioning him, they discovered he had an outstanding warrant tied to that earlier domestic violence case, the one where he never appeared in court. He was arrested and charged with second-degree murder and illegal use of a dangerous weapon, with his bond set at $500,000. His attorney was adamant that police had the wrong man, insisting there was nothing in Harris's background to suggest he was capable of this, and that he had cooperated fully with investigators, even allowing him to search his home and car. But for Chiquita's family, spread across Chicago, Atlanta, and her adopted home in Louisiana, the grief was immediate and consuming. Her sister put it simply, every day without her sister was harder than the one before. What they wanted, more than anything, was closure and justice for the woman who had spent her entire career fighting for exactly that on behalf of other people. Number 3, Nathaniel Code. Some killers strike once and disappear. This next man walked into homes across the same neighborhood and left almost nobody alive inside them. Nathaniel Robert Code, Jr. was born on March 12, 1956, in Shreveport, Louisiana. His parents divorced only 6 months after his birth, so he was raised instead by his great-aunt and his grandfather. As a child, people around him noticed something unsettling. He would stop mid-sentence and simply stare blankly into space before continuing on as if nothing had happened. There were also alleged incidents of him setting fire to animals during his adolescence. He failed the 9th grade and dropped out of high school shortly after, moving in with his uncle. In 1971, that same uncle shot him 4 times during an argument. Code managed to run 4 blocks before collapsing, and he survived. In 1975, at 19 years old, Code was charged with aggravated rape and burglary after assaulting a 20-year-old woman. He pleaded guilty to attempted aggravated rape and was sentenced to 15 years in prison. While he was locked up, his mother died. He was released early in 1984 on good behavior and found work as a contractor. But after attacking a co-worker over a dispute about a radio station, he was fired. In February of 1986, he married a woman named Vera. His first known murder came in August of 1984, even before his release date would suggest, when he broke into the home of 25-year-old Deborah and Ford by prying open a bathroom window screen. He bound her, gagged her, stabbed her repeatedly, and slit her throat. At the time, with almost no leads, investigators simply called it an unsolved mystery and offered a small reward for information. Code wasn't identified. Then, in the early hours of July 19, 1985, he committed what would become a defining act of his crimes. He broke into a home on Cedar Grove 72nd Street and killed 4 people in one night. Vivian Cheney, 34. Billy Joe Harris, 28. Carlotta Colbert, only 15 years old. And Jerry Colbert, 25. The brutality of what investigators found inside the house was almost impossible to describe. Billy Joe Harris had been shot through a pillow, then had his throat slashed, his hands and ankles bound. Jerry Colbert was shot once while sleeping. 15-year-old Carlotta was found with her hands tied behind her back, gagged with duct tape, her throat cut so deeply she was nearly decapitated. And Vivian Cheney was found slumped over a bathtub, bound, beaten, and ultimately killed through a combination of strangulation and drowning. Her clothing carried a large amount of her own daughter's blood, meaning she had been alive and present while her 15-year-old daughter was being murdered in front of her. 2 young girls in the home at the time, 7 and 10 years old, survived. The bodies were discovered by a relative who had just arrived by taxi. Even the assistant police chief, a man with 25 years on the force, said he had never seen anything more vicious. A retired FBI profiler later noted striking similarities between these murders and the earlier killing of Deborah and Ford, describing the same calling card of manipulation, domination, and control. 2 years later, in August of 1987, Code beat and stabbed his own 73-year-old grandfather to death, striking him 13 times, binding and gagging him. In that same attack, he also murdered 2 children who were present in the home, 12-year-old Joe Robinson Jr. and 8-year-old Eric Williams, both strangled with cord after being bound and gagged. Investigators were struck by how personal and vicious this particular attack was, wondering if it had been carried out by someone close to the family. It had been. Cole was also suspected, though never formally charged, in several other unsolved killings from the same years. Following the murder of his grandfather, investigators interviewed Code, initially only as a routine contact because of his relationship to one of the victims. During that interview, he made statements that raised suspicion while still denying involvement. His fingerprints were taken and matched the evidence from the crime scene. Once he was in custody, another fingerprint match tied him directly to the 1985 Cedar Grove massacre as well, and the same modus operandi tied him back to the earlier murder of Deborah and Ford. His arrest stunned people who knew him. Co-workers and even his own wife insisted he was a good and caring man incapable of this kind of violence. He was charged with 8 counts of first-degree murder in total, but stood trial only for the 4 Cedar Grove killings. During that trial in 1990, a witness testified he had seen Code with blood on his arms hours after the murders and had heard him claim he'd been in a fight and come out on top. The defense argued it would have taken more than one person to kill 4 people simultaneously, and also argued that a convicted, Code shouldn't receive the death penalty due to mental health issues, including a diagnosis of borderline personality disorder. None of it swayed the jury. After more than 450 pieces of evidence and over 100 witnesses, the jury took only 1 hour to find him guilty on all 4 counts. He was sentenced to death. Code has spent decades since then filing appeals, all which have failed, still denying he ever committed any of the murders. In 2013, he was among several death row inmates who sued over extreme heat conditions inside the prison. The reaction from victims' families was blunt. As the brother of 15-year-old Carlton Colbert put it, Code lost every privilege the day he decided to take his sister's life, along with the lives of the others in that house. Number 4, Sean Vincent Gillis. This next man confessed his crimes almost the moment police caught him, and what he described chilled even seasoned investigators. Sean Vincent Gillis was born on June 24, 1962, in Baton Rouge. His father abandoned the family shortly after his birth, and he was raised instead by his mother and grandparents. His criminal record began small, with traffic citations, a DUI, drug possession, and contempt of court starting when he was 17. But in 1994, he committed his first known murder. Years later, after his arrest, a friend of one of his victims began exchanging letters with him. She eventually turned those letters over to prosecutors, and in them Gillis expressed remorse, particularly over having mutilated the bodies of the women he killed. He described himself, in his own words, as pure evil, and admitted that sometimes he committed murder without even understanding why he was doing it. Gillis once claimed the killings began out of stress. His first murder was of 82-year-old Ann Bryan in March of 1994. He'd intended to rape her, but when she screamed as he touched her, he panicked, slit her throat, and stabbed her 50 times, leaving her body in her own home in a retirement community in Baton Rouge. In May of 1999, he spent 3 weeks stalking a woman he'd seen jogging in South Baton Rouge. When he finally caught 52-year-old Hardy Schmidt jogging early one Sunday morning, he struck her with his car, knocked her into a ditch, wrapped heavy plastic wire around her neck, and forced her into his vehicle. He drove her to a park, raped her, killed her, and kept her body in his trunk for 2 days before dumping it. He continued killing for 5 more years without ever being connected to any of it. His final victim was 43-year-old Donna Bennett Johnston in February of 2004. He raped her, strangled her with a nylon tie, and then mutilated her body after death, cutting her, removing a nipple, gouging out a tattoo, and severing her arm at the elbow. In the letters he later wrote about that murder, he described her final words as simply saying she couldn't breathe, and admitted he still puzzled over his own compulsion to mutilate her afterward. When police searched his home following his arrest, they found dozens of digital photographs of Johnston's mutilated body, along with photos of other victims that were later used against him in court. He kept parts of his victims' bodies as souvenirs. What ultimately caught him wasn't DNA alone, at least not at first. It was tire tracks found near Donna Bennett Johnston's body. Investigators traced a unique tread pattern to a specific tire model that had only been manufactured for 3 years and had only been sold 90 times in the entire Baton Rouge area. Combined with a DNA swab that matched evidence from several of his victims, police arrested Gillis on April 29, 2004. Once in custody, he confessed with almost no resistance, eventually admitting to 8 murders total. He was initially charged in 3 of those killings and stood trial in July of 2008. The jury found him guilty, but deadlocked during the penalty phase, resulting in a life sentence rather than death. A year earlier, he had already pleaded guilty to a separate second-degree murder charge for the killing of 36-year-old Joyce Williams. Gillis remains incarcerated at the Louisiana State Penitentiary. And in a strange twist of fate, an entirely separate serial killer, Derrick Todd Lee, had been operating in that very same city during those very same years, each one unaware of the other, each one leaving his own trail of victims across Baton Rouge. Number 5, Kenneka Jenkins. Not every case on this list involves confirmed killer. This next one is about a 19-year-old girl, a hotel party, and a death that her family has never fully accepted as an accident. On September 10, 2017, Kenneka Jenkins, a 19-year-old from the west side of Chicago, was found dead inside a walk-in freezer at the Crown Plaza Hotel near O'Hare Airport in Rosemont, Illinois. She had been at a party there the night before. Kenneka had borrowed her mother's car and left home around 11:30 at night to attend a private gathering with friends in one of the hotel rooms. She arrived just after 1 in the morning. Witnesses at the party said she seemed off almost immediately, swaying as she greeted people, and while several saw her drinking cognac, none reported seeing her use any drugs. One witness said she wasn't acting like herself, dancing only briefly before sitting down looking sad. She spoke to her sister on the phone for the last time around 1:30. Hotel security footage later showed her wandering the halls, appearing increasingly intoxicated, before being seen near the front desk around 3:20 in the morning. Minutes later, she was seen exiting an elevator on a lower floor. The very last footage of her alive, time-stamped 3:32 a.m., showed her walking into an unused hotel kitchen and rounding a corner toward the area where the freezer was located. The freezer door itself was out of camera view. About an hour after that, her friends called her mother from Kenneka's own car, telling her they couldn't find her and had left the party, though they still had her phone with them. Her mother rushed to the hotel, arriving around 5:30 in the morning, but staff told her they couldn't access surveillance footage until Kenneka was formally reported missing to police. When she called the police non-emergency line just after 7 that morning, she was told it would be best to wait a few more hours, since people often turn up on their own. It wasn't until nearly 1 in the afternoon that Kenneka's older sister filed an official missing persons report. Family members have said ever since that the initial police response felt painfully slow. That evening, her mother and sister went door to door to the hotel themselves, eventually prompting a staff member to call 911 out of frustration. It wasn't until 10 that night that police reviewed footage and finally spotted Kenneka stumbling through the hallways. But her exact location remained unknown until an employee discovered her body inside the freezer just after midnight. She was pronounced dead minutes later. She was found lying face down, with one shoe off, and no visible signs of trauma beyond a small cut on her foot. Investigators later measured the freezer's internal temperature at 34 degrees Fahrenheit, roughly 2 hours after the doors had been opened. The medical examiner ultimately ruled her death accidental. No illegal drugs were found in her system, but her blood alcohol level was 0.112. Traces of a seizure medication called topiramate were also found, even though she'd never been prescribed it, and when combined with alcohol, that drug can intensify the effects of both substances and speed up the onset of hypothermia. Signs of that condition were confirmed in her autopsy. Investigators also noted that the credit card used to book the hotel room was fraudulent and linked to a Chicago area gang, though officials maintained that none of the rumors of foul play were supported by actual evidence. Even so, questions lingered. Why was an unused kitchen freezer even turned on? Why did none of her friends' accounts fully agree with one another? In 2018, the family's attorney filed a $50 million lawsuit against the hotel, at one point presenting photos suggesting the freezer door could be locked from the outside, though that claim was later disputed by the actual physical evidence at the scene. In December 2023, the lawsuit was settled for $10 million, with court records showing the hotel and other defendants were found negligent for failing to properly secure that kitchen area, for allowing an unauthorized party to happen on their property in the first place, and for failing to thoroughly review their own security footage once Kenica had been reported missing. Number 6. Monique Kitts. This next story isn't about a stranger breaking into a home in the middle of the night. It's about a wife who decided her husband was worth more to her dead than alive. Monique Kitts was a former daycare operator from Louisiana. On the surface, she and her husband, Corey Kitts, a 40-year-old father too, seemed like an ordinary family. But underneath, prosecutors say Monique was drowning in debt and desperate for money, and she saw a solution in her husband's life insurance policy and employment benefits, worth more than $500,000 combined. On July 9, 2010, Corey Kitts was shot 3 times at point-blank range while he slept in his bed in their home in Addis, Louisiana. When emergency services were called, a recording of that call would later be played in court, one where Monique appeared to feign shock and grief at discovering her husband's body. But the investigation quickly unraveled a much more calculated plot. Monique hadn't pulled the trigger herself. Instead, she had orchestrated the killing through a web of accomplices, ultimately paying a man named Carl Michael Howard, a Verizon employee from Atlanta, to act as a hitman. The case might have stalled there, but days before the trial began, one of the accomplices, a man named Corey Knox, decided to cooperate with prosecutors. He confessed to having cased the house alongside Howard and to serving as the getaway driver on the night of the murder. His testimony connected the phone records and financial transactions directly back to Monique. A former lover of hers also testified that she had paid him on previous occasions in an effort to find someone willing to carry out a contract killing. In November 2014, after a 3-week trial that drew significant public attention, a West Baton Rouge parish jury unanimously convicted both Monique Kitts and Carl Howard of second-degree murder and conspiracy to commit second-degree murder. In March of 2015, Monique was formally sentenced to life in prison, without the possibility of probation or parole. Howard received the exact same sentence. Monique later appealed her conviction, arguing the evidence against her was insufficient and alleging misconduct by prosecutors. But the Louisiana Court of Appeal upheld both her conviction and her sentence. Her story would eventually be featured on true crime programs, including Oxygen Snapped, turning a private betrayal inside one Louisiana marriage into a cautionary tale watched by audiences across the country. Number 7. Ronald Dominique. This last case belongs to a man who, for nearly a decade, quietly became one of the most prolific serial killers in modern American history, almost without anyone outside Louisiana ever hearing his name. Ronald Joseph Dominique was born on January 9, 1964, in Thibodaux, Louisiana, the youngest of 6 children born to poor laborers living in a trailer park on the edge of town. Growing up, he was known as melancholic, socially awkward, and overweight, and he was bullied throughout school for it. He didn't drink, didn't do drugs, and didn't play sports, which only isolated him further from his classmates. He sang in the school choir, but shortly before finishing school, he discovered he was gay and began visiting a local gay bar. When classmates saw him there, the harassment against him only intensified. Dominique, for his part, always denied being gay when confronted. After graduating high school in 1983, he briefly attended a nearby university to study computer science, but dropped out within a couple of years. He struggled to hold down steady work and often lived off family members, particularly his mother and older sister. In 1985, he was arrested for making harassing phone calls of sexual nature. In 1994, he was arrested for drunk driving. And in 1996, a young man jumped out a window at the home where Dominique was living and told neighbors that Dominique had raped him and tried to kill him. Dominique was arrested, but prosecutors were never able to locate or identify the alleged victim, and the case was eventually dropped. As an adult, Dominique never married and had no children. He spent much of his free time in gay bars, often dressed as his idol, singer Patti LaBelle, though he struggled to form any lasting relationships and was often looked down upon within the local gay community. His murders began in July of 1997. His victims tended to be teenage boys and men, mostly African American, and not all of them identified as gay. Dominique typically met them while driving around in his pickup truck or hanging around gay bars, luring them in with promises of alcohol, drugs, a place to stay, or group sex with a supposed girlfriend. Once he got them back to his trailer, he would overpower them, bind them, and rape them, then strangle them to death before loading their bodies into his truck and dumping them across several nearby rural parishes. His first confirmed victim was 19-year-old David Mitchell, found in a ditch near a highway. His death originally ruled an accidental drowning, despite his father's insistence that his son was too strong a swimmer for that explanation to make sense. Over the following years, Dominique claimed victim after victim: 20-year-old Gary Pierre, 38-year-old Larry Ranson, 27-year-old Oliver LeBanks, 16-year-old Joseph Brown, 18-year-old Bruce Williams, 21-year-old Manuel Reed, and 34-year-old Angel Mejia and Mitchell Johnson. Each case, investigated on its own, looked like an isolated tragedy. Nobody yet realized they were connected. The killings continued into the 2000s. 23-year-old Michael Vincent, 20-year-old Kenneth Randolph Jr., 26-year-old Anoka Jones, 19-year-old Datrell Woods, whose death by asphyxiation was initially blamed on his asthma rather than murder, 46-year-old Larry Matthews, who wasn't even reported missing at first because he was homeless, 21-year-old Michael Barnett, Dominique's first white victim, 22-year-old Leon Lirette, 31-year-old August Watkins, whose murder finally led police in two different jurisdictions, Kenner and Houma, to realize they might be looking at the same killer, and the case was handed over to the FBI. 23-year-old Kurt Cunningham, 28-year-old Alonzo Hogan, 17-year-old Wayne Smith, 40-year-old Chris DeVille, who was hitchhiking away from the aftermath of Hurricane Katrina when Dominique picked him up, 21-year-old Nicholas Pellegrin, whose death investigators initially assumed was drug-related because of an unrelated debt he owed to local dealers. And finally, 27-year-old Christopher Sutterfield, killed in October of 2006 after the two men had been informally dating. In November of 2006, a man named Ricky Wallace came forward and told police that Dominique had lured him to his trailer with promises of drugs and sex, then tried to convince him to be tied up as part of some supposed arrangement with a girlfriend. Wallace refused and was allowed to leave, and though his account was initially met with skepticism, it was enough for police to bring Dominique in for questioning. While being held, he agreed to give a blood sample. Within a week, that DNA matched semen found on two of his earlier victims. An arrest warrant was issued, and on December 1st, 2006, Dominique was arrested at a homeless shelter. He later told police he'd known his arrest was only a matter of time and had actually moved out of his sister's home so as not to inconvenience her once it happened. Once in custody, he cooperated fully, confessing to all 23 murders in detail that only the real killer could have known. Despite this, he never fully admitted guilt in a legal sense, insisting instead that many of his victims had voluntarily agreed to be restrained in exchange for money, and claiming that if someone refused, he simply let them go unharmed. As for his motive, Dominique said he wanted to eliminate any witnesses, unwilling to ever go back to prison after his earlier rape arrest, a fear he said had left him in a near-constant negative emotional state. In September 2008, after accepting a plea deal, Dominique was found guilty on all charges and sentenced to 8 consecutive life terms without the possibility of parole. By avoiding trial and pleading guilty, he also avoided the death penalty. He remains incarcerated today at the Louisiana State Penitentiary in Angola. Following his conviction, the FBI stated that his case represented the most significant serial homicide investigation in the country in the previous 2 decades, both in terms of the number of victims and the length of time over which the killings took place. And yet, compared to other cases on this list, his name remains one that most people outside of Louisiana have simply never heard.